Rhinathos had a perfect memory, and she could remember every single student in her class at the Galactic Union Academy. But when someone asked her about the human, she had to pause and think for a moment before she could even recall his face. His name was Ethan Mercer, and he was the only human enrolled at the Academy on the great station world of Valeth Prime, where the brightest young minds from over 200 species came to train as explorers and soldiers and diplomats, and everything in between. He sat in the back row of every lecture hall, and he never raised his hand, and he never spoke unless a professor called on him directly, and even then his answers were short and correct, but delivered so quietly that most students forgot he had spoken at all. Rin was a Vilari, and she stood 7 feet tall with a hard, insectoid exoskeleton, the color of dark copper, and compound eyes that could track 40 objects at once, and she was ranked 3rd in the entire class, and she had opinions about everyone, but Ethan Mercer did not even register on her list of people worth thinking about. He was just there like a piece of furniture that someone had placed in the corner of the room and never moved. The Academy was full of extraordinary beings, and it was impossible not to notice them everywhere you looked, and Dorvan the Draelkin was 8 feet of scaled muscle and teeth, and his voice alone could shake the walls when he laughed, and the Corvani students floated through the corridors like living gemstones, their crystalline bodies refracting light into tiny rainbows wherever they walked, and the Seolith moved in perfect unison, 3 or 4 bodies sharing one cold, and calculating hive mind, their pale eyes scanning everything with the patience of machines. And then there was Ethan, who was 5'10" with brown hair and brown eyes, and a face that could blend into any crowd on any world in the galaxy, and he carried his tray in the mess hall and sat alone, and ate whatever was in front of him without complaint, and then he left. Nobody bullied him, because nobody cared enough to bother. Rin saw him once in the mess hall when a serving drone malfunctioned, and dropped a tray of hot liquid from the upper rack, and she saw Ethan's hand snap out and catch the tray before a single drop hit the ground, and his arm moved so fast that it blurred, and then he set the tray down gently on the counter and walked away as if nothing had happened and nobody else even noticed. She noticed, but she filed it away and forgot about it within the hour. There was a sparring hall on the 42nd level of the Academy where students tested themselves against each other, and Dorvan loved it there, because he could throw smaller species across the room and laugh about it, and one afternoon he pointed a massive clawed finger at Ethan, who was passing through the corridor outside, and said, "Come in, human, let me see what you can do." Ethan looked at him, and his expression did not change, and he said, "No thank you," and kept walking. Dorvan laughed so hard that the sound echoed off the walls, and he turned to his friends and said, "The human is afraid," and they all laughed with him, and Rin, who was stretching in the corner, laughed too, although something small and quiet in the back of her mind told her that what she had seen in Ethan's eyes was not fear. It was not fear at all. Humanity was still new to the Galactic Union, and most species did not know much about them, except that they came from a small blue planet in an unremarkable solar system, and they had only made first contact about 100 years ago, and they were considered a minor species with no particular gifts and no special abilities, and their world had been classified as a Class 7 planet, which meant it was temperate and moderate, and not especially dangerous or interesting. The Academy accepted Ethan because the Union required at least one representative from every member species, and no other human had applied, and so he was there to fill a seat and nothing more, or at least that was what everyone assumed. Late at night, when the corridors were empty, Rin sometimes passed the xenobiology library on her way back to her quarters, and she would see a light still on inside, and if she looked through the window, she would see Ethan sitting alone at a terminal with dozens of files open on the screen, and all of them were about Deathworlds. Class 10, Predator Behavior, and Class 11, Atmospheric Hazards, and Class 12, Survival Case Studies, and he read them with the kind of focus that Rin had only ever seen in students preparing for something they knew was coming. She thought it was strange, but she did not think about it for long. 3 weeks before the end of the term, the Academy made the announcement that everyone had been dreading, and the Commandant herself stood at the front of the Great Hall and said the words that made half the room go silent and the other half go pale. The Deathworld Survival Exam. It was the final test, and it was pass or fail, and there was no alternative and no exemption, and the rules were simple enough that even the most terrified student could understand them, and they were as follows. Teams of 5 would be dropped onto a real uncharted Deathworld with minimal equipment, and they would have 72 hours to survive and document the environment and reach the extraction point. And if they made it back alive, they passed, and if they did not, then they did not. Some species sent formal petitions to have their students removed from the exam, and the Gridari delegation argued that their people were engineers, not survivalists, and the Corvani pointed out that certain planetary conditions could be lethal to crystalline biology, and even the Draelkin, who feared nothing, publicly admitted that the exam had a historical casualty rate that was not zero. Ethan did not react at all. He sat in his seat in the back row and he listened, and when the announcement was over he picked up his bag and walked out, and his face was exactly the same as it always was, which was to say it showed nothing. The teams were assigned by the Academy's AI sorting system, and the algorithm was supposed to create balanced groups, but in practice, the top students formed alliances early and requested each other, and what was left over got shuffled together into teams that nobody expected to survive. Ethan's team was one of those leftover groups. He was assigned with Rhinathos, who was talented but too proud to beg for a better team, and Dorvan, who had insulted too many classmates to get picked by anyone, and Lysiel, a Corvani, whose crystalline body was considered too fragile for field work, and Fetch, a tiny trembling Gridari, who was a genius with machines but could barely walk a mile without wheezing. When the 5 of them stood together in the briefing room for the first time, Dorvan looked at his team and then looked at Ethan and said, "We are going to die." Ethan looked at each of them one by one and said nothing, and then he sat down and began reading the planetary file for their assigned Deathworld, and the room was very quiet after that. That same evening, in the faculty wing of the Academy, a xenobiologist named Professor Thakin was reviewing planetary classification data for a routine audit, and she found something that made all 6 of her eyes blink at once. The file on Earth, the homeworld of the human species, listed it as Class 7, which meant temperate and moderate and safe, but the original survey had been conducted by a single scout ship that had landed on a coastal region during the planet's mildest season, and had spent less than 3 days on the surface, and had never ventured inland or underwater or to the poles or to the deserts or to any of the places where Earth truly showed what it was. Thakin pulled the raw data, and she ran it through the full classification algorithm, the one that accounted for tectonic instability and oceanic predators and atmospheric extremes and parasitic organisms and megafauna, and weather patterns and extinction event history. And when the algorithm finished processing and the new rating appeared on her screen, she sat very still for a very long time. The number on the screen was not Class 7. The number on the screen was Class 12. The maximum. She flagged the file for formal review and marked it urgent, and as she leaned back in her chair, she thought about the quiet human boy who sat in the back of every classroom, and she wondered if anyone at this academy had any idea what was sitting among them. The shuttle hit the atmosphere of Kitharak 4 like a stone thrown into boiling water, and the whole cabin shook so hard that Fetch grabbed the nearest solid object, which happened to be Ethan's arm, and held on with all 4 of his tiny clawed hands, and made a sound that was somewhere between a whimper and a prayer. Kitharak 4 was a Class 10 Deathworld, and everything about it was designed by nature to kill anything that set foot on its surface, and the briefing F. Isle had listed the hazards in a long and terrible list that included superheated jungle canopy and carnivorous megaflora and apex predators, exceeding 8 tons in pockets of toxic atmosphere and electromagnetic storms that could fry unshielded technology. And Rhinathos had read every word of that file 3 times, and each time she finished, she felt less confident than before. The shuttle doors opened, and the heat hit them like a wall, and Dorvan, who had spent his whole life on a cool, dry world, staggered back a step, and Lysiel's crystalline skin immediately began to fog with condensation, and Rin's compound eyes took a moment to adjust to the dense green light that filtered through the jungle canopy above them. Ethan stepped out first. He did not stagger, and he did not pause, and he stood on the soft alien soil, and he looked up at the towering trees, and he looked down at the ground, and he breathed in deeply through his nose, and something shifted in his face that was so subtle none of them could name it, but if they had to try, they might have called it recognition. The shuttle lifted off behind them, and the sound of its engines faded, and then they were alone. Dorvan cracked his massive knuckles and said, "Right, then I will lead us to the extraction point, which is 40 kilometers north, and we will move fast and crush anything that gets in our way." And he said this with the confidence of someone who had never been truly afraid. Rhinathos immediately disagreed and said they should move slowly and carefully and map the threats as they went and catalog everything, because the documentation score mattered as much as survival. And Dorvan called her a coward, and Rin called him a brute, and within 2 minutes they were shouting at each other, while Lysiel tried to mediate and Fetch tried to disappear into his own backpack. Ethan was not listening to any of them. He was crouched at the edge of the clearing, and he was touching the soil and looking at the bark of the nearest tree, and watching the way the leaf litter moved, and he tilted his head slightly, and his eyes tracked something in the canopy that none of the others had noticed, and then he stood up and walked back to the group, and said, "We need to move west first before we go north." Dorvan stared at him and said, "Why?" Ethan pointed to the ground where the soil was darker, and said the drainage pattern flows east, which means there is lower ground that way, and lower ground in a jungle like this means standing water, and standing water means the largest predators will be concentrated along that corridor. And if we push north from here, we walk right through their hunting lanes. The group was quiet. Ethan looked at them and said, "West takes us to higher ground and drier air, which will help Lysiel. And then we can cut north along a ridge line where we will have visibility and fewer ambush points." Rhinathos opened her mouth and then closed it because she had been about to say the same thing, but she had not gotten there yet, and Ethan had seen it in the dirt in less than a minute. They moved west. Within the first hour, the jungle began to test them, and it started small with insects the size of fists that swarmed around any exposed skin, and plants with barbed leaves that whipped out when something passed too close, and vines that tightened when touched, and fungi that released clouds of stinging spores when disturbed. And every step felt like the planet itself was reaching out to taste them. Dorvan powered through with brute strength, and Rin mapped threats with her compound eyes, and Lysiel used what little telekinesis she could manage in the humid air to push obstacles aside, and Fetch clung to the back of the group and tried not to scream. Ethan moved through the jungle like he belonged there. He stepped over roots without looking down, and he ducked under branches at exactly the right moment, and he seemed to know which plants were dangerous before they moved, and he walked with a kind of quiet ease that did not match the terror of everything around them. And when Rin watched him, she felt something cold move through her, because she had seen predators move like that on documentary footage, and the word that came to her mind was not student or teammate. The word was native. 2 hours and they heard the sound. It started as a low vibration in the ground beneath their feet, and then it became a rhythmic thumping like something very large was moving through the undergrowth, and then the bushes ahead of them parted, and 6 creatures emerged in a loose semicircle, and they were each the size of a ground transport, and they had 6 legs and no eyes, and their heads were flat and wide, and covered in sensory pits, and their mouths were full of teeth that curved inward like hooks designed to grip and never let go. Dorvan roared and charged the nearest one because that was what Draelkin did, and his fist connected with the creature's skull with a sound like a thunderclap. But the thing barely moved, and it whipped its head sideways and caught Dorvan across the chest with its jaws, and threw him 10 meters into a tree trunk, and he hit the ground gasping. Rin froze and her mind raced through tactical options, and found none that worked, and Lysiel raised her hands to use telekinesis. But the humidity had weakened her so much that she could barely lift a stone, and Fetch made a sound that was not a word and covered his eyes. Ethan did not freeze. He looked at the creatures, and he looked at the ground, and he grabbed a fallen branch that was thick and long, and he jammed one end into the soft earth at a sharp angle, so that the broken tip pointed outward at chest height, and then he did something that made no sense to any of them. He started stamping his foot on the ground in a slow, heavy rhythm. The lead creature turned toward him immediately because it hunted by vibration, and it could feel him through the earth, and it locked onto the signal, and it charged, and it was fast and terrible, and its mouth opened wide enough to swallow him whole. Ethan did not move. He stood behind the planted branch, and he stamped once more, and the creature lunged straight at the source of the vibration, and the sharp, broken tip of the branch punched through the soft tissue under its jaw and into the space behind its skull, and the creature's momentum drove it forward onto the stake, and it shuddered once and went still. The other 5 creatures stopped moving instantly, and they circled for a moment, and then they smelled the blood of their alpha, and something in their behavior changed, and the coordination broke apart, and they scattered into the jungle one by one, until the clearing was silent again. Ethan pulled his foot free from the mud and wiped his hands on his pants, and said they hunt by vibration, and pack predators lose coordination when the alpha falls, and it is basic ecology. Nobody said anything for a long time. Rin helped Dorvan to his feet, and the big Draelkin looked at Ethan with an expression she had never seen on his face before, which was something close to confusion, because Dorvan understood strength, and he understood speed, and he understood ferocity, but he did not understand what Ethan had just done, because what Ethan had just done was something else entirely. It was not strength, and it was not speed, and it was not power. It was knowledge and patience, and the willingness to stand perfectly still, while death charged straight at him. They kept moving, and as the day wore on, Ethan quietly took over, and nobody voted on it, and nobody announced it, and it just happened, because every time there was a decision to make, Ethan already had the answer, and every time there was a danger ahead, Ethan had already seen it. He found water by following the flight paths of small avian creatures, and he tested it by smelling it and touching a drop to his tongue, and he said it was safe, and it was. And he identified 3 separate species of toxic plant by the subtle color variation in their leaves that no one else could see, and he chose a campsite that was elevated and backed against a rock face with only one approach, and he built a fire. When he struck the sparks and the flames caught, and the warm light pushed back the darkness of the alien jungle, Fetch stared at the fire with wide eyes and said, "How did you do that?" Ethan fed a branch into the flame and said, "Fire is the oldest technology, and humans figured it out a very long time ago." That night, while the others slept and the fire crackled, and the jungle screamed with the sounds of things killing other things in the dark, Fetch sat next to Ethan, who was keeping watch, and the little Gridari said, "Ethan, how do you know all of this, and how are you not afraid?" Ethan was quiet for a while, and the firelight moved across his face, and he said, "Humans camp a lot." Rhinathos was not asleep. She was lying in the dark with her datapad open and her compound eyes reflecting the glow of the screen, and she had opened the Galactic Union's Xenobial Augie database, and she had typed in one word: human. And what she found in the next 20 minutes made her antennae go rigid and her breathing stop, and her heart's beat so fast that she could hear them both pounding inside her thorax, because the file on humans was not what she expected. It was not what she expected at all. She looked up from the screen and across the fire at Ethan, who sat calmly in the dark with his eyes open and his back straight, and his gaze moving slowly across the tree line, watching for threats the way something watches that has been watching for threats since before it could walk. And for the first time since she had known him, Rhinathos felt afraid of the quiet boy who sat in the back of the class. The second day on Kitharak 4 began with the sky turning the color of a bruise and a sound like 1,000 drums rolling across the horizon. And Ethan looked up at the clouds and said, "Electromagnetic storm, and we need to get underground now." Nobody argued with him anymore. They ran and the wind picked up behind them, and the air began to taste like metal, and Rin could feel her datapad flickering as the electromagnetic pulses started to interfere with everything electronic. And Ethan led them toward a rock formation he had spotted the evening before, and at its base, there was an opening just wide enough for Dorvan to squeeze through, and they pushed inside one by one as the storm crashed down on the jungle above them like an angry god. The cave system was dark and cool, and for a moment it felt like safety until the walls began to glow. Bioluminescent fungi covered every surface in soft blue and green light, and the glow was beautiful in the way that a poisonous flower is beautiful, which is to say it was a warning, and Ethan knew it immediately because he put his hand over his nose and mouth and said, "Cover your faces now and do not breathe deeply." Lysiel asked why, and then the first cloud of spores drifted down from the ceiling like glowing dust, and Fetch inhaled a tiny amount, and his legs went numb in seconds, and he sat down hard on the cave floor and said, "I cannot feel my feet." The fungi were releasing paralytic spores, and the deeper they went the thicker the clouds became, and Rin tore a strip from her equipment pack and wrapped it around her breathing slits, and Dorvan did the same, but the Draelkin's massive lungs had already pulled in more air than the others, and he began to slow down, and his steps became heavy and clumsy, and his eyes started to lose focus. Ethan wrapped cloth around his own face, and then he stopped and listened, and he tilted his head and closed his eyes, and he said, "There is airflow coming from the left tunnel, which means it leads to an exit." Rin asked how he could possibly know that, and Ethan said he could feel the air moving against his skin, and hear the way the sound changed in that direction. And it was not magic, and it was not technology, it was just the kind of thing you learned when your ancestors had spent 100,000 years navigating dark places without any light at all. They moved into the left tunnel, and it was narrow, and the spores were thick, and Dorvan was getting worse, and his massive body was shutting down as the paralytic compound spread through his bloodstream, and he leaned against the wall and said in a slurred voice, "Just leave me and come back after the storm." Ethan looked at him and said no. And then Ethan did something that should not have been possible. He crouched down and got his shoulder under Dorvan's arm, and he stood up, and he lifted the Draelkin's weight across his back, and Dorvan weighed 3 times what Ethan did, and Ethan's legs shook, and his spine compressed, and blood began to leak from his nose from the sheer physical strain, but he started walking. He walked for over a mile through that dark tunnel carrying a creature that outweighed him by hundreds of pounds, and his muscles screamed, and his joints ground together, and every breath through the cloth mask was a battle, and Rin walked beside him, and she could hear the sounds his body was making, and they were terrible sounds, and she said, "Ethan, you are going to hurt yourself." Ethan did not stop, and he did not slow down, and through gritted teeth, he said, "I am not leaving anyone behind." Meanwhile, in the gaps between crises, Rin read more of the human file on her datapad, and every new section made the last one look tame. She read about persistence predation, and she learned that humans were not ambush hunters, and they were not venom users, and they were not pack coordinators like the Seolith, and they did not have claws or fangs or armor or any of the things that most predator species relied on. Instead, humans simply followed their prey. They would pick a target and they would walk after it, and the prey would run, and the humans would walk, and the prey would run again, and the humans would walk, and this would continue for hours and sometimes days, because humans could regulate their body temperature through sweating, which almost no other species in the galaxy could do, and they could maintain a slow, steady pace over distances that would kill most creatures. And eventually, the prey would collapse from exhaustion, and the humans would simply walk up to it and kill it. The Vilari word for this was Kethful, which translated roughly as the horror that does not stop. Rin read about human omnivore adaptability and learned that humans could eat almost anything organic, and they ate plants and meat and fungi and insects and fermented biological matter, and they consumed a chemical called capsaicin, which was a compound that plants had evolved specifically as a weapon to cause pain to anything that tried to eat them, and humans ate it on purpose, and they enjoyed it, and they put it on everything. She read about human trauma resilience and learned that humans could lose entire limbs and survive, and they could break bones and keep fighting, and they could lose blood in quantities that would kill a Vilari twice over and still remain conscious. And their bodies produced a natural chemical called adrenaline that flooded their systems in moments of danger, and temporarily increased their strength and speed and pain tolerance to levels that bordered on the impossible. She read about Earth, and she learned that the planet had experienced 5 mass extinction events, and each one had wiped out most of the life on the surface. And after each extinction, the survivors had evolved and adapted and become harder and more resilient and more dangerous. And the species that eventually rose to dominance was not the biggest or the fastest or the strongest. It was the most stubborn. She found the pending reclassification report that Professor Thakin had flagged, and she read the details, and she learned that the original survey of Earth had been conducted in a single coastal region during the mildest season, and the survey team had never gone to the places where Earth truly revealed itself. They never went to the deep oceans where creatures with teeth, the length of a forearm, hunted in absolute darkness at pressures that would crush a Vilari like paper. They never went to the deserts where temperatures reached levels that could cook flesh and nothing grew and nothing lived, except the things that had evolved to thrive in hell. They never went to the polar regions where the cold was so extreme that exposed skin would die in minutes. They never went to the jungles where everything was poisonous and everything was hungry, and the plants themselves had learned to eat animals. They never went to the places where the ground itself split open and poured liquid rock across the surface. If they had gone to those places, the classification would never have been Class 7. The true rating was Class 12, and that was the maximum, and it meant that Earth was not a garden world where a gentle species had developed in comfort and safety. Earth was a death world, and it always had been, and the quiet boy carrying a 300-pound reptile on his back through a cave full of paralytic spores was not performing well despite being human. He was performing well because of it. They emerged from the caves into gray daylight, and the storm was still rumbling in the distance, but the worst had passed, and Ethan set Dorvan down gently on the ground, and then he sat down himself, and his arms were shaking, and his nose was still bleeding, and his face was white with exhaustion. Dorvan's feeling was returning, and he flexed his massive clawed hands and looked up at the human who had carried him, and he said in a voice that was raw and honest and stripped of all pride, "What are you?" Ethan wiped the blood from his upper lip and said nothing. Later that day, they reached a river, and it was wide and fast, and the water was dark, and Ethan built a raft from fallen logs and vine in under 30 minutes, and he studied the current patterns by tossing leaves into the water and watching how they moved, and he said they should crow SS at an angle to avoid being swept into a rapid section downstream. They were halfway across when something hit the raft from below. The water exploded upward, and a massive shape lunged out of the river, and it had a flat head and rows of teeth, and it was easily 5 meters long, and its jaws closed on the edge of the raft, and the whole structure tilted, and Fetch screamed, and Lissil grabbed onto Rin, and Dorvan tried to reach for his weapon, but could not find his balance. Ethan did not grab a weapon. He leaned forward, and he drove his fist into the creature's sensory cluster, which was a soft spot just behind its jaw, and he hit it once, and then twice, and the second time something cracked, and the creature released the raft and thrashed backward into the water and vanished. Ethan sat back down on the raft, and his knuckles were split open and bleeding, and he wrapped them with a strip of cloth without saying a word. Rin stared at him, and she thought about what she had read, and she thought about everything she had seen in the last 2 days, and she looked at this small, quiet human who was bleeding from his hands and still watching the water for the next threat, and she finally understood. He was not a student who had been dropped into a survival situation. He was a survival situation that had learned to be a student. That evening they made camp on higher ground, and the air was drier, and Lysiel's crystalline body was recovering, and Rin noticed that the route Ethan had chosen had taken them away from the most direct path to the extraction point. And when she asked him about it, he said the ridge line was better for Lysiel, because the humidity was lower up here. Rin said that the detour would add hours to their journey, and Ethan looked at her and said she is on the team. And that was all he said about it, because for Ethan it was not a calculation or a trade-off, and it was not a question of efficiency versus compassion. It was just what you did. You did not leave people behind, and you did not sacrifice the weak for the fast, and you carried what needed carrying, and you walked the longer road if it meant everyone made it home. Rin sat by the fire that night, and she looked across the flames at Ethan, who was sharpening a stone tool with calm, practiced hands, and the light played across his face, and she saw him clearly now, not as the forgettable boy from the back row, but as something far older and far more dangerous than anything on this planet. A creature born on a world that had spent 4 billion years trying to kill everything on it. And he had won. The third day broke gray and heavy, and the jungle was quieter than it had been, and Ethan did not like the quiet because on a Deathworld silence did not mean peace, and it meant that something had scared everything else into hiding. They were 12 kilometers from the extraction point, and Ethan could feel it in his legs and his ribs, and his swollen knuckles that they were close, and that closeness was the most dangerous part, because it was the part where people started to relax. He told the team to stay tight and stay alert, and Dorvan, who had not argued with Ethan since the cave, nodded, and Lysiel moved closer to the group, and Fetch climbed onto Dorvan's shoulder, where he had a better view, and Rin walked beside Ethan, and her compound eyes swept the tree line in all directions. They came through a narrow pass between 2 ridges where the jungle canopy was thick and the light was dim, and that was where the ambush happened. 3 Sealith stepped out of the shadows in perfect unison like mirrors of each other, and their pale eyes were cold and empty, and they moved with the mechanical precision of a single mind, operating 3 bodies, and they had been waiting here for hours. Rin recognized them immediately as Team 7, which was one of the highest-ranked groups in the academy, and the Sealith were a hive-mind species, which meant that these 3 individuals shared one consciousness and one tactical brain, and they could coordinate their movements with 0 delay and 0 miscommunication. And in combat exercises at the academy, they had never lost. The tallest Sealith spoke, and its voice had the flat, emotionless quality of something that did not experience feelings the way other species did. And it said, your equipment and supplies will improve our survival metrics, and your elimination will reduce competition, and we have calculated that this is the optimal strategy. Dorvan snarled and said you would attack fellow students. The Sealith tilted its head and said the exam rules do not prohibit it. And then they moved. The first one fired a neural disruptor at Dorvan, and the beam hit him in the chest, and his nervous system locked up, and he crashed to the ground like a falling building. And the second one threw a sonic charge at Fetch that shattered the little engineer's toolkit and sent him tumbling off Dorvan's shoulder. And the third one swept Rin's legs out from under her, with a strike so precise that she hit the ground before she even registered the impact, and her right forelimb cracked against a rock and she fell. Something break. Lysiel tried to fight, and she raised her crystalline hands and tried to gather telekinetic force, but the humidity had drained her, and she could barely push the air in front of her, and the first Seolith backhanded her casually, and she fell. It all happened in less than 4 seconds. The 3 Seolith turned to look at Ethan, who was the only one still standing. Their shared consciousness processed what it saw, and the tactical assessment was immediate and confident, and it read as follows: species human and no notable combat adaptations and physical metrics below average for the class and threat level minimal. One of them stepped forward and said, "Do not resist, and this will be quick." Ethan looked at his team on the ground, and he looked at Rin holding her broken limb, and he looked at Fetch curled up and trembling, and he looked at Dorvan paralyzed and helpless, and he looked at Lysil cracked and dim on the forest floor. And something changed in his eyes. It was not rage, and it was not panic, and it was not the wild desperation of a cornered animal, and Rin, who was watching from the ground through the pane, saw it clearly, and what she saw was a door opening behind those brown human eyes, and behind that door was something very old and very patient and very, very dangerous. Ethan breathed out slowly, and his shoulders dropped, and his center of gravity lowered, and his hands came up, and he said nothing at all. The first Seolith attacked with a precise calculated strike, aimed at the nerve cluster in Ethan's neck, which would have dropped any known species in one hit. Ethan moved. He did not move the way the Draelkin moved with power and force, and he did not move the way the Seolith moved with precision and prediction, and he moved the way water moves when it goes around a rock, which is to say, he was simply not where the strike landed, and then he was somewhere else entirely, and his hand closed around the Seolith's wrist, and he twisted, and the joint made a sound like a branch breaking. The hive mind adjusted instantly, and the other 2 attacked simultaneously from opposite angles, because the Seolith fought as one, and they could predict patterns better than any combat AI in the galaxy, and their coordination was flawless. But Ethan did not have a pattern. He blocked the strike from the left with his forearm, and absorbed the impact, and the bone bruised beneath the skin, and then he dropped low and swept the legs of the one on the right, and when the third one lunged at him, he grabbed a fistful of mud from the ground and threw it directly into its sensory pits, and the Seolith staggered back blinded for half a second, and half a second was all Ethan needed. He hit it once in the center of mass with an open palm strike that sent it stumbling, and then he turned and caught the second one's arm as it swung and used its own momentum to throw it into the first one, and they went down in a tangle, and Ethan picked up a fallen branch and held it like a weapon and waited. The 3 Seolith regrouped and their shared consciousness recalculated, and this time the assessment was different because the human was still standing, and he had taken hits that should have slowed him down, and he was still standing, and his eyes had not changed, and they were locked onto the Seolith, with the focus of something that had already decided how this was going to end. They attacked again, and this time they came with everything, and the fight was brutal and fast, and Ethan took damage because he was not invincible, and he was not superhuman, and a strike to his ribs cracked something, and a kick to his thigh made his leg buckle, and a blow to his jaw split his lip, and blood ran down his chin. But he got up. Every time they put him down, he got up, and this was the thing that the Seolith could not process, because their tactical models did not account for a species that simply refused to stop, and their predictions kept failing, because Ethan did not fight like a trained soldier, and he fought like something else entirely, and he fought like an animal that had been cornered one too many times, and had learned that the only way out was through. He used everything around him, and he kicked a rotten log that collapsed onto one of them, and he wrapped a vine around another's leg, and pulled it off balance, and he threw rocks and dirt. And when he had nothing left to throw, he used his hands and his elbows and his knees and his forehead. And he kept getting up. The Seolith's shared consciousness began to experience something it had never felt before, and the sensation flooded through all 3 bodies simultaneously, and it was cold and sharp, and it made their movements hesitate for the first time in their existence, and it took the hive mind several seconds to identify what the feeling was. It was fear. They were afraid of him. Not because he was stronger than them, because he was not, and not because he was faster, because he was not, and not because he was smarter, because they could outthink him 100 times over. They were afraid because he would not stop. They had hurt him and broken him and bloodied him, and he kept getting up, and his eyes never changed, and they stayed locked on and focused and certain with the absolute unshakable conviction of something that had decided it was not going to lose, and it did not matter what it cost him, because the people behind him were his people, and he would stand between them and anything that tried to hurt them until his body physically could not stand anymore. And even then Rin suspected he would crawl. The Sealith retreated. They backed away, and their pale eyes were wide, and they moved in unison as always, but now their movements were fast and jerky, and they disappeared into the jungle without a word because there was nothing to say, and their tactical models had been wrong, and the quiet human from the back of the class was something they had no framework to understand. Ethan stood alone in the clearing, and his fists were bloody, and his ribs were cracked, and his left eye was swelling shut, and his breath came in short, painful gasps, and then his knees buckled and he dropped to one knee and braced himself against the ground with one hand. Fetch scrambled to his side and said, "Ethan, are you okay?" and tried to stop the bleeding from the cut on his jaw. Ethan pushed his hand away gently and said, "Help, Rin first, her arm is broken." Rin watched him from the ground with her broken limb cradled against her body, and something in her chest ached, and it was not a physical pain, and it was the ache of watching someone give everything they had for people they had known for 3 days. They bandaged each other and splinted Rin's arm with jungle wood and vines, and Ethan tied the knots because his hands were the steadiest even though they were the most damaged, and then he stood up and said, "We have 8 kilometers to go, and we should move." They moved, and Ethan led the way, and he limped, and his breathing was labored, and every step clearly hurt him, but he did not slow down, and he navigated by the stars when Fetch's equipment failed, and he helped Lysiel over rough ground, and when Fetch fell behind because his short legs could not keep up, Ethan picked him up without a word and carried him on his back. That night during the final push with the extraction point, only a few kilometers away, Lysiel walked beside Ethan, and her crystalline body pulsed with dim light, and she asked him something that had been building inside her since the first day. She said, "Ethan, why did you never tell anyone what you could do, and why did you hide for so long?" The jungle was dark around them, and the stars were visible through a break in the canopy, and Ethan was quiet for a long time, and the only sound was his boots on the ground and his careful, controlled breathing. Then he said, "Where I come from, the loud ones do not last, and you learn to be quiet, and you learn to watch, and you learn that the ones who survive are not the strongest, and they are the ones who never give up." He paused, and then he said, "Besides, I did not want you to be afraid of me." Lysiel's crystalline body glowed, and the light was warm and soft and steady, and among the Corvani, this was the expression of deep and wordless respect, and the light stayed with her for the rest of the night like a candle that someone had lit inside her chest. They walked on through the dark, and Ethan led them, and his body was broken, and his hands were wrapped in bloody cloth, and his ribs ground together with every breath, but his eyes were clear, and his steps were sure, and he did not stop. He never stopped. They came out of the jungle at dawn, and the extraction zone was a flat clearing on a hillside where the Academy's shuttles waited in a neat silver row, and the proctors stood at the perimeter with their data pads and their scanners, and their calm, professional expressions that were trained to show nothing. Ethan's team was the first to arrive. The proctors did not believe it at first because the schedule said that Team 3, which was an Aldraelkin squad, was expected to arrive first, and Team 7, the Sealith Hive Mind unit, was expected second, and Team 12, which was the name assigned to Ethan's group of leftovers, was expected either last or not at all. But there they were. Dorvan came through the tree line first because he was the biggest and the most visible, and his scales were scratched and dull, and his chest still ached from the neural disruptor. But he walked with his head high, and behind him came Lysiel, whose crystalline body was clouded and cracked in places, but still glowing with that warm, steady light. And then Rhinathos with her broken forelimb bound in a splint of wood and vine, and her compound eyes sharp and alert. And then Fetch riding on the back of the last figure through trees. Ethan Mercer walked into the extraction zone carrying Fetch on his shoulders, and his face was bruised and his lip was split, and his left eye was swollen nearly shut, and his knuckles were wrapped in bloody cloth, and his ribs were cracked, and he was limping on his right leg, and he looked like something that had been through a war. He looked like something that had one. The proctors stared, and one of them, a tall Vilari officer, checked his datapad 3 times, because the data did not match his expectations. And the data said that this team had the highest environmental documentation score of any group, and the fastest extraction time, and 0 casualties, and all 5 members alive, and accounted for. Led by the human. The lead proctor stepped forward and said team designation, and Ethan set Fetch down gently, and straightened up as much as his broken ribs would allow, and said Team 12 reporting and all members present. The proctor looked at him for a long moment, and then looked at the team behind him, and then looked back at Ethan, and said you may proceed to medical and well done. Ethan nodded once and then he turned to his team, and the 5 of them walked together toward the medical shuttle, and nobody said anything because nothing needed to be said. The news spread through the academy like fire through dry grass. Team 12 had finished first, and Team 12 was the leftover squad, and Team 12 was led by the human, and the human had killed a pack alpha with a sharpened stick, and carried a Draelkin through a cave, and punched a river predator in the face, and fought 3 Seolith alone and won, and he had done all of it while being the quietest person in every room he had ever entered. Within hours, the footage from the team's documentation sensors was being reviewed by faculty and students alike, and the combat instructors watched Ethan's fight with the Seolith frame by frame, and a Draelkin weapons master who had been teaching at the academy for 40 years sat back in his chair, and said to his colleague, "We have been measuring the wrong things this entire time." The Seolith delegation filed a formal request that humans be excluded from future combat evaluations, and the language of the request was careful and diplomatic, but the meaning underneath was clear, and it was not a complaint about fairness. It was a request born from self-preservation. And then the reclassification was announced. Professor Thakin presented her findings to the full Academy Assembly, and the Great Hall was packed with every species and every student and every faculty member, and the room was so full that people stood along the walls and in the doorways, and Ethan sat in his usual seat in the back row. Thakin explained that the original classification of Earth as a Class 7 world had been based on an incomplete survey, and that a full analysis of the planet's environment, including its oceans and deserts and polar regions and tectonic activity and atmospheric extremes, and the full range of its predatory fauna, and its parasites and diseases, and its 5 mass extinction events had produced a new rating. She put the number on the screen and it was Class 12. The maximum possible rating. The room was silent in a way that Rin had never experienced before, and it was not the silence of boredom or confusion, and it was the silence of 200 species, simultaneously realizing that the small, quiet creature sitting in the back row had grown up on one of the most dangerous planets in the known galaxy. Every student in that room turned to look at Ethan, and for the first time in his life at the academy, every single pair of eyes was on him, and he did not flinch, and he did not look away, and he sat in his seat with his bandaged hands resting on the desk, and his bruised face calm and his expression exactly the same as it had always been. Quiet and patient and utterly unreadable. In the days that followed, something shifted at the academy, and it was not dramatic, and it was not sudden, but it was real and permanent, and the students who had once ignored Ethan now stepped aside when he walked through the corridors, and some of them nodded at him, and some of them avoided eye contact entirely, and the ones who had mocked him did not mock him anymore. His team became something that none of them had expected. Dorvan, who had laughed at Ethan on the first day, stood before his clan's representative at the academy and declared Ethan his shieldkin, which was the highest honor in Draelkin culture, and it was reserved exclusively for someone who had saved your life at the risk of their own, and the declaration was binding and permanent, and it meant that Dorvan would fight beside Ethan for as long as they both lived. Lucille called Ethan to her quarters, and when he arrived, she reached up to her own shoulder and broke off a small shard of crystal from her own body, and the act of separation clearly caused her pain, but she held the shard out to him, and it glowed with the same warm light that had stayed with her since the jungle, and she said, "This is a piece of me, and among my people, we only give this to those we consider part of ourselves," and she pressed it into his palm and closed his fingers around it. Fetch simply refused to leave Ethan's side, and he followed him to lectures and sat next to him in the mess hall and walked beside him in the corridors. And when someone asked Fetch why he did this, the little Gridari said, "Because he carried me, and because I was afraid and he was not, and because he is my friend." Rhinathos published an academic paper titled Persistence Adaptability and the Deathworld Hypothesis, and it detailed everything she had learned about human evolutionary biology and survival strategy, and she used Ethan as a case study with his permission, and the paper was picked up by the Union's academic networks, and within a week, it had been read by researchers on over 300 worlds. The paper's conclusion was a single sentence that Rin had spent more time writing than any other sentence in her life, and it said this: "The human species should not be measured by what they are, but by what they refuse to stop being." One evening near the end of the term, Ethan sat alone on a balcony on the upper level of the academy, overlooking the stars and the galaxy stretched out before him in a river of light, and he sat with his elbows on his knees, and his bandaged hands hanging loose, and his face turned upward, and the bruises were fading now, but still visible. Rhinathos found him there, and she stood in the doorway for a moment and watched him, and then she walked out and sat beside him. She said, "I have a question for you." He said, "Okay." She said, "Why did you come here? And you must have known that they would underestimate you, and you must have known that you would be alone, and I want to understand why you chose this." Ethan looked at the stars for a while, and the light reflected in his brown eyes, and then he smiled, and it was a small smile, but it was real and warm, and it was the first time Rin had ever seen him smile. He said, "Because someone told me once that the universe does not care how loud you are, and it only cares whether you keep going." Rin looked at him, and she thought about the boy who had sat in the back of the class, and the boy who had caught a falling tray when no one was watching, and the boy who had faced down a charging predator without flinching, and the boy who had carried a teammate on his broken back, and the boy who had stood alone against 3 attackers for people he barely knew, and the boy who had walked bleeding through the dark and never once stopped. She sat beside him on that balcony, and the stars burned above them, and for the first time in his life at the academy, the quiet human did not sit alone. In the faculty wing that same evening, the Academy's central AI completed its update of Ethan Mercer's student file, and the previous entry had read low-priority student with no notable threat profile and species classification unremarkable. The updated entry read as follows: Name Ethan Mercer. Species human. Homeworld Earth, Class 12 Deathworld. Classification Apex Class Adaptive Predator. Threat Assessment Recalculating. The AI processed the data again, and the assessment still read recalculating, and it processed it a third time and a fourth, and each time the result was the same because the system's models had no category for what Ethan was and no framework that could contain him, and the word it finally settled on was not a rating, and it was not a number. It was simply undefined. And across the galaxy in the months and years that followed, a quiet story began to spread from world to world and station to station. And it was not a story about warships or weapons or conquest, And it was not a story about a species that shouted its dominance from the rooftops. It was a story about a boy who sat in the back of the class and said nothing and asked for nothing. And when the universe tested him, he stood up and carried his friends through the fire. And when it was over, he sat back down and was quiet again. And the story carried a warning that was not spoken in words, but felt in the spaces between them, and the warning was simple. The humans are quiet, and the humans are patient, and the humans remember, and the humans adapt, and the humans do not give up. They never ever give up.